Howdy. Good evening. I'm Sam Kirkpatrick, the Executive Associate Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Welcoming you to the Lenore and Francis Humphreys International Speakers Program that's hosted by our Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs under the direction of Ambassador Larry Napper. We're grateful to the Humphreys for their generous support and for making this lecture series possible each year, as well as to the staff support at the Scowcroft Institute. And as usual, we ask that you refrain from photos and please turn off your electronic devices. We're honored to have Dr. George Rupp with us here this evening as our Humphreys speaker. A graduate of Princeton, Yale, and Harvard, came to Texas following a post as Dean of the Harvard Divinity School to become president of Rice and served there in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Oversaw great growth in research and in private support for Rice. He then left Houston to become president at Columbia University, where he provided leadership for enhancing the undergraduate experience and engaging with the New York City community. For nearly a decade now, Dr. Rupp has been immersed in the international community as president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. That committee was founded as a nonprofit in 1933, initially as the American branch of the International Relief Association, to offer life-saving care and life-changing assistance to refugees to flee from war or natural disasters. In his leadership role, he's responsible for the agency's relief and resettlement activities and assistance programs here in this country. Working in more than 40 countries, he leads their advocacy efforts on behalf of the world's most vulnerable people. Tonight he's going to talk to us about the role of IRC and will speak on local conflicts and global challenges and subsequently take questions from the audience. Please, George, join me in welcoming Dr. George Rupp.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's great to be back here at A&M, at the Bush School, at the Scowcroft Institute. It's been a number of years since I had the pleasure, and it looks as if wonderful happenings continue to go on here. As Sam indicated, I would, in my remarks, like to sketch a challenge that confronts all of us in our increasingly interconnected world. It's the challenge of uprooted individuals, families, whole communities. In the world at large, there are over 40 million such uprooted people. They're called refugees if they've crossed an international border. They're internally displaced people if they're still within their own country. But in any case, they are uprooted from their homes and communities and are underway. These millions of people figure prominently in our sense of dislocation worldwide. Throngs of people fleeing with only what they can carry on their backs. Long lines of supplicants for water, food, application papers. And on the positive side, families rejoicing as they are reconnected after they've been separated through their flight. The challenge that I'm inviting all of us to reflect together on this evening is how to find durable solutions to the tough problems that these multitudes of uprooted people face. This is a global challenge, and it's often rooted in local conflicts. It helps to understand the challenge if we see how these local conflicts break with the pattern of war that we have come to take for granted because it has been more or less dominant for almost all of the last 300 years, at least in our experience here in the West. Now, the timing of when it begins, we could have interesting debates about. I'm kind of a nut about symmetry, so I date its beginning in the 30 Years' War, the so-called Wars of Religion, that ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, the end of the Holy Roman Empire, even if some version of the Holy Roman Empire continued for more than a century. And on the other end, and this is where symmetry comes in, I would date it with the 30-year serial conflict in Vietnam. Now, this 300-year block of time had characteristics of war that are quite different from the local conflicts I want to focus our attention on. First of all, during that 300-year period, war what tended to be between nation states, which really came to dominate at least European history, starting with the Peace of Westphalia, tended to be between nation states. And the conflicts that I'll ask us to focus attention are most typically within nominally unified countries. So that's one significant difference in terms of the pattern of war and this new face of war. Second difference is the wars that we have tended to identify through this 300-year period are almost always in the multiple single digits of years. So a long war was 6 or 7 or 8 years. In contrast, the conflicts I'm going to be describing are almost always decades long. So from somewhere in the single digits to multiple decades is the second difference. And thirdly, the wars that come to mind when we think of wars over this 300-year period had conventions that developed, most prominently the Geneva Conventions, that insisted that casualties should be focused on armed combatants rather than civilians. And this didn't always work out, but the goal was at least 90% of the casualties would be combatants rather than civilians or non-combatants. Now, there are obviously exceptions. The carpet bombing of London and Dresden, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, maybe most egregiously the Holocaust, where the vast majority of casualties were civilians. But the war itself was designed in a way that it was supposed to, if countries were responsible, they were supposed to target their fire on combatants rather than non-combatants. The conflicts that I'm going to be describing dispense with that gentility. Perhaps 90% of the casualties are civilians, because the conflict is between armed groups that simply don't observe the conventions that characterized war over the 300-year period I've described. Examples of what I'm describing would be the conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo, especially Eastern Congo, or in Sudan, between the North and the South, now two separate countries, but within even the remaining nominally unified Sudan, between Darfur, the west of Sudan, and the core of the country. Or if we allow for the inclusion or the intrusion of outside forces, then certainly Iraq and Afghanistan would illustrate the new face of war that I'm describing. Now, the International Rescue Committee is focused on the challenge posed by these conflict-uprooted people, and we're focused on it worldwide. Sam characterized or gave a quick description of the International Rescue Committee. Let me give just a little more detail. We were founded in 1933, as we like to remind people, at the suggestion of Albert Einstein, who said that it would be very good to have a committee of notables based in New York who worked with counterparts, the International Relief Organization, as Sam mentioned, counterparts in Europe, to rescue refugees from the Nazis and help them get back on their feet in the United States. So that's the source of our very odd name, Rescue Committee, the Committee of Notables. Now, the committee was a committee of notables. It included not only Albert Einstein, but Reinhold Niebuhr, John Dewey, many other notables, mostly based in New York, but not exclusively. The earliest purpose then was to help refugees who came here get back on their feet in this country. And you know, it was a relatively easy task with the refugees who fled here in the 30s and early 40s. highly intelligent, well-educated people who might need a little help in getting their feet on the ground but could flourish rather quickly. But we continue that core purpose of our organization, and so we are one of the agencies that works with the State Department in resettling refugees in this country. And we still have, we now have 22 resettlement offices around the U.S., and we work under the tight constraints and high demands of the State Department in making sure people are on their feet, taking care of themselves within a matter of months. And many of our staff are themselves former refugees who are accustomed to dispensing the tough love required to get on your feet and support yourself and your family within a matter of months. It's exhilarating work. I enjoy going around to our resettlement offices. The closest ones from here are Dallas and Abilene, but we have, as I say, 20 others beside those two. It's exhilarating to see how much people can accomplish and how quickly they can accomplish it and how soon they own their own homes, they're sending their kids to college, and so on and so on. But we don't work only in the United States, and numbers tell stories to me, so let me tell you the numbers that tell this story. I mentioned that there are over 44 million uprooted people in the world. The presidentially set ceiling for the number of refugees who can be admitted to the United States this year is 75,000. If you do the arithmetic, that means only 2 out of every 1,000 of the uprooted people in the world have any prospect of being resettled in the United States. Or to put it the other way around, 998 out of every 1,000 will have to get up back on their feet in some other place. And that's why we work in 40 countries around the world, where larger numbers of uprooted people will have to find their way. Now, you'll be relieved that I won't talk about all 40 countries in which we operate, but especially since the person who invited me to give this address, Ryan Crocker, or Dean Crocker, is now serving in Afghanistan. I thought, as ambassador, I thought I would use Afghanistan as an example because it really is a way of seeing the multiple dimensions of the work that we do in working in trying to serve uprooted people. We have been involved, the International Rescue Committee has been involved with Afghan refugees for over 30 years. Since the beginning of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when as many as 7 million Afghans fled into Pakistan. And we've worked with them in Pakistan since 1980. We've also worked with Afghans to be resettled into this country. So over the 30 years, about 7,000 Afghans have been the IRC has resettled 7,000 Afghans in this country. And you know, if you go in a major city and there's an Afghan restaurant, the chances are it was either is being run now or it was started by an Afghan refugee. And they've been very successful. They've very quickly assimilated into our country and have become productive citizens. And it's terrific that 7,000 Afghans have made new lives in the United States. But as I indicated, just not counting the ones that went to Iran, just the ones that went into Pakistan were about 7 million. So that means in that case, now more Afghans have been resettled in the U.S. than the 7,000 whom we resettled. But in this case, 1 out of every 1,000 we've helped to resettle in this country. So we've worked initially with those refugees in Pakistan. And we've done, I think, extraordinary work. And I have, my favorite school in the whole IRC network is in Peshawar, Pakistan, in which we educated Afghan girls, have educated Afghan girls for 30 years. The terrific human capital has been developed, and it's been extremely important that they have developed skills because the vast majority of those Afghan refugees have now gone back into Afghanistan. There's a small fraction of the 7 million, perhaps as many as 800, 900,000 are still in Pakistan, and they're Pashtuns who've integrated into the Pashtun society of Pakistan. That's where the kids grew up and people have just stayed there. But the vast majority have gone back home, and they have had the credentials to be able to, those of whom we've at least worked with have had credentials to be able to make a contribution. Let me give you one example. The girls who graduated from this school in Peshawar and got a certificate, we negotiated with the Afghan Ministry of Education that credential would qualify them to be teachers in Afghanistan. And as you know, a major priority of post 2002 Afghanistan has been to have more and better educated girls or women, and without teachers that would be very hard to do. But in addition to working in Pakistan, with Afghan refugees in Pakistan, we also have worked with Afghans back in Afghanistan, and we've been there since 1988, more or less. As the Soviets withdrew, we moved in. We've helped Afghans to get resettled, and I frankly find my visits to Afghanistan among the most intriguing that I have, because I can see the real progress we've made in the more than 20 years we've worked there with Afghans. I go and people will point out an orchard of apple trees, and they'll say, well, see that orchard? The IRC gave us the seedlings that led to that thriving orchard, and now they not only have apples for themselves and their communities, but also sell them in the markets and take them into the larger cities. Or they'll point out a stand of fast-growing poplars that grow the straight trees that are used as the ridge poles in the kind of mud and brick huts that Afghans build. And they'll say, well, you know, the IRC gave us the seedlings that led to that nursery of, now all run by Afghans, but that nursery of poplars. Or we'll look at a water system, and we'll have worked with them to design it, and we'll have trained Afghan engineers, so they've designed many more such water systems. Or we will look at schools and see that those teachers that were trained in Peshawar have come back and are now teaching in those schools. I'd like to describe one program that seems to me to capture what we do in Afghanistan, but also what we try to do in the best of our programs around the world. It's called the National Solidarity Program. And we have a couple of connections to it, but one of the most intriguing is that when we designed the program, the person who was the Minister of Rural Development in the Karzai government in Afghanistan, a man named Hanif Atmar, had been the head of our programs, the IRC programs in Afghanistan, before he went into the government. And he knew that we had a program like what became the National Solidarity Program, in other places in the world. In particular, he knew about it in Rwanda, which had a similar problem that Afghanistan had, namely, Rwanda had a fairly competent, well, this is not true of Afghanistan, but Rwanda had a competent central government, but it had no reach into outside of the capital. And so the National Solidarity Program was designed in Rwanda to help the government do community-driven construction in the boondocks, away from the capital, away from Kigali. So Hanif had, this is before my time at the IRC, but Hanif Atmar, the minister in Afghanistan, had a Rwandan staff member who was central in designing that program come to Kabul and consult with the Afghans in designing a similar program for Afghanistan. The National Solidarity Program is the result. It was initially funded by the World Bank. It also has major funding now from USAID and other sources. And the funds go through the Ministry of Rural Development, which initially was very well led by Hanif Atmar, who then went on to other appointments within the Karzai government, but nonetheless is still, I think, quite well run. And the way it works is we develop a village council. Our Afghan staff, develop a village council in villages that elect their own representatives and then decide what their highest priority development project is. It's sometimes a water system, sometimes a school, sometimes a clinic, but always one that the local community has an enormous investment in. And then the funds come through the Ministry of Rural Development for that particular project, all very carefully monitored and audited. We're now in 2,000 villages in Afghanistan doing that project with now this is our 12th year doing it, so we've been there a long time. It's exhilarating to go and to see the tremendous projects that we have and the ownership that those villages have of those projects. And I have at times gone and visited programs where the State Department will tell me, no, you can't go there, that's an insecure area. I go with our Afghan staff. They're clearly highly regarded by the locals. And I have a chance to see projects that are really enormously satisfying. We have in Afghanistan now over 500 staff, all but a handful, so 99% are Afghans. All of those involved in the National Solidarity Program are Afghans, and it's an example of the way in which patient, long-term, community-driven development is possible even in highly insecure places. And it's therefore representative not only of what we do in Afghanistan, but what we like to do in places across the world. Well, I said you'll be relieved that I didn't plan to talk about all of the 40 countries where we operate, but I thought it might be useful if I just mention a couple of lessons that seem to me to come out of the places where we do operate, including Afghanistan. So, 3 lessons. First lesson, from the beginning, build capacity. Let me give you contrasting examples. We've been involved we were involved in Aceh in Indonesia before the tsunami hit and also after the tsunami hit. We were involved before it because there was a conflict going on there between a rebel group and the government, and one of the blessings of the tsunami was that conflict was resolved much more quickly than it otherwise would have. But we were very quickly present because we had already been present, so we could ramp up our activities. We already had Indonesian staff, so we could increase the numbers of Indonesian staff. And instead of collecting in Banda Aceh, where the vast majority of NGOs collected, we went to remote fishing villages, and we worked with local people to get supplies there. They couldn't, the roads were all washed out, so they had to either be flown in or brought in by boat, to rebuild boats. These people knew how to support themselves, but all of their boats, virtually all of them, had been destroyed. So in terms of building capacity, we worked with locals. They knew the designs. They knew what had to be done. They needed some help in jump-starting in terms of materials and resources. And very quickly were able to get on their feet. Well, that illustrates building local capacity. On the other side of the coin would be a place like Darfur in Sudan, where we also were very active. I think we did very important work. We ran the health programs in the largest of the displacement camps, Kalma camp, which was very important and life-saving activity. But we really couldn't do much in terms of building capacity because the Sudanese government would not allow those people to go back home. In fact, the Sudanese government had empowered the Janjaweed militia to destroy the homes that they had and wanted them very much to be contained. So that's an example where as much as we wanted to build capacity, it just wasn't feasible. I'm not saying we always get this right, but at least we know what our goal is, and it's Aceh, not Darfur, in terms of our goal. And that's why we focus on education, on employment and training so that people will be able to take care of themselves. We also recruit local staff and train them, and we develop local partnerships with organizations that are there on the ground that we help to develop further so that they will continue to be there when we leave. So, first lesson from the beginning, build local capacity. Second lesson, sound government is crucial. I'm going to use an example that at first it's hard not to smile, or at least I can't help smiling or even chuckling when I think about it because it seems so completely contrary to sound governance, and it is. That's why I'm using it as an example. The Democratic Republic of Congo. Many of you know a little bit about the history of the DRC. It had a long history of excruciatingly bad government. It goes back to the King Leopold II of Belgium, who was as the king who used Congo, what then was called the Belgian Congo, as a private colony for 25 years, from 1885 to 1925, from 1885 to 1910, so 25 years. And then for another 50 years, it was a Belgian colony, which was simply rapaciously exploited for its raw materials. Then finally, independence, 1961. You may remember the name Patrice Lumumba, who was elected to be the president of Congo, who was assassinated. Lots of rumors that CIA was involved. Who knows? We have people here who might know more about that than I do. But in any case, he was assassinated, and a person who was thought to be maybe friendly to the West, Mobutu Sese Seko, became the president. And for the next 30 years, again, ruthlessly exploited Congo. Mobutu finally was ousted in 1997. In the years up to his ouster, so the mid-90s into the mid-2000s, there was just vicious fighting in Congo. We were present at the time. Partly we were present because we had been very actively involved in Rwanda and worked with some of those who fled Rwanda into the DRC. And we had some very talented epidemiologists and public health experts who did mortality surveys in Congo. And the macabre goal was to identify the level of mortality above the already very high expected base level of mortality. These studies have been debated, published in Lancet, I think very widely accepted as authoritative. And they come up with a sobering number of more than 5 million Congolese dead in this fighting over that roughly 10-year period. 5 million above the already high baseline that would have been expected if there hadn't been fighting. So overwhelmingly civilian casualties in this ongoing conflict. Now 5 million, that's an abstract number. I lived in Manhattan when 9/11 happened, so I have some sense of how traumatic the deaths of 9/11 were for this country and for New York City in particular, but also Washington and Pennsylvania where the other deaths occurred. So 5 million would be the equivalent of 9/11 every day for 5 years in a row. So this is an enormous number of casualties in this fighting that's gone on. And it's not surprising that communities are decimated. People are uprooted, but the whole community, the whole infrastructure is decimated. Well, the IRC has worked in DRC now for 15 years. And we have a program like the National Solidarity Program. In Congo, it's called Tungani, which is Swahili for let's move forward together. And it works the same way. So we're in 2,000 villages, ironically just about the same number of villages as in Afghanistan. And we're helping to build governance at a very decentralized level in a place that has not known decent government for a long time. So Congo is, in a sense, a negative statement about what happened, why governance is crucial, but also incipiently a positive statement. It's a very long way to go before Congo is back on its feet, and especially eastern Congo. But it is absolutely clear that a country can't flourish if there isn't a base level of sound government. And this is a lesson for the United States in particular to hear loud and clear, because we all know that bashing government is something of a sport in this country, and that we forget that what we take for granted when we criticize government is that we have a base level of government which allows us the luxury of criticizing it. And I spend a lot of time in places where there's too little government, not too much government. And I assure you that the rhetoric that calls for less and less government is ill-informed if it thinks we can survive without at least a base level of government that assures secure communities. So that's the second lesson. Sound governance is crucial. The third lesson is catastrophe prevention is better than emergency intervention. Catastrophe prevention is better than emergency intervention. Now, there are a lot of ways in which we can undertake catastrophe prevention, and I won't talk about all of them, although we might have a chance to talk about some of them in the question period. But I want to mention two, one very briefly and then one a little longer. The brief one is catastrophe prevention is one weapon, one arrow in the quiver of catastrophe prevention is trade. To have trade regimens that provide benefits on all sides of the transaction, and in particular to take into account the needs for economic flourishing in developing countries. Maybe a little easier to sell this now when the developed economies are in such terrible shape, and in fact, developing economies are doing, comparatively speaking, far better. But nonetheless, trade is one way in which catastrophe prevention can be implemented. And I'm delighted, I'm on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations, so I just found out that Andrew Card, acting dean here, and Tom Daschle have co-authored a study for the CFR on the need for a new trade regimen. And that's really important because trade as a set of issues has simply been stalled. The last formal trade agreement that was passed is the Uruguay round. There was an agreement that tariffs would be reduced so that if developing countries would reduce their tariffs, then they would be allowed to export more readily. Frankly, the deal was kept by the developing world, but not by the developed world, and so trade has not yet increased. And so I hope that Andy Card and Tom Daschle and others who speak for increased trade help to lead us toward that, because we certainly need to have it. But I want to spend on a second issue. I want to take a little bit more time because it's also very timely, even though, no doubt, even more unpopular than it often is, namely aid, international development assistance and humanitarian relief. It is absolutely crucial that the United States resume its leadership in this area. And we have to talk about resume because we are way, way behind. And I'm puzzled, I have been puzzled for years now, at the disconnect between what we as an American public think we're doing in international relief and development and what we are in fact doing. And I have a two-pronged hypothesis about how to account for this. The first is that private donations are certainly part of aid, and the United States is without question by far the most generous country in terms of private donations. We have a culture that encourages it. We have institutional structures that encourage it. We have tax benefits that encourage it. But one of the reasons, and we should be very proud of the fact, we are in fact leading the world in private donations. But the second part of the hypothesis is, in terms of our government-provided assistance, we in fact used to do much better. And some of us remember, I don't mean some of us here, when the American public is asked how much of the federal budget goes for foreign assistance, people will say things like 25% or 20%. And I mean, the fact that it's less than 1% is something that only comes out much later. But what's crucial is that we do vaguely, as a society, as a culture, remember when once we did do that better. Now, I'll give you some comparative numbers. I admit I'm not picking these just at random, but nonetheless, they make the point. If we look at 1948, the height of the Marshall Plan, when this country did what very few countries have ever done, namely made major investments in assistance to countries we had just been fighting in a war. In 1948, the fraction of the federal budget that went to international assistance was 18%. 18%. Not so far from the 25% that people imagine we are giving now. It's 18%. And if we turn that into a percentage of gross domestic product, which I want to use as a comparison in other ways, it's about 2.6%. So 2.6%. Fast forward to the early 60s. At that point, the fraction of the federal budget that went for international relief and development was 6%. Still, 6%, of the budget. But that translates at that time into 0.6% of the gross domestic product, 0.6%. Fast forward to now, and this is after significant growth during the Bush administration. So it's not that we haven't made some efforts in the right direction, but now we're a bit under 1% for international relief and development, 1% of the federal government's budget. And that translates into 0.2% of gross domestic product, 0.2%. You can do the arithmetic from 2.6% of gross domestic product to 0.2%. I mean, we've had a massive decline, in that case, 12-fold decline since 1948. Now, we simply have to do better. Maybe I should, because numbers strike me as concrete, but they strike many people, as my wife tells me, as abstract. So the 0.2%. Imagine the whole of the U.S. government, the U.S. budget, our gross domestic product, as a $10 bill. $10. 0.2% means 2 pennies out of that go for international relief and development. 2 pennies. Now, let's go back to the fact that we were generous privately. If we really stretch and count everything that we give through for corporations and foundations and universities and so on, private donations, churches, we might get another 2 pennies. So if you count everything, we might be 4 cents out of $10. That's how little we do in terms of international relief and development. Now, we have formally, publicly declared the goal of getting to 0.7% for our official development assistance. We did that in the World Food Summit in 1996, in Monterey in 2002, and Glen Eagles in 2005. No doubt we'll be doing it again. This is a generally accepted target for developed countries. Countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Luxembourg have exceeded that target. They're over 1% rather than 0.7%. We're at 0.2%. So we are way off the mark of what we ourselves have committed ourselves to. Now, there are lots of rationale, arguments that we can give for why we have to do more in terms of international assistance. Let me mention 2 before coming back to the fact that really by far the most important is the moral argument, that we just need to live up to our core values. But let me give you a few others if you find moral arguments distasteful. The first is a security argument. And I can be brief on this because your former president, Bob Gates, has been eloquent in making this case. Sure, we need to have the Defense Department expenditures. Surely we need to have diplomacy. And we also need to have development. And we need to have all 3 of those, or if we don't fund development and diplomacy adequately, it will wind up costing far more in the long run in terms of defense expenditures. I'll give you a concrete example. We're all very much aware of the famine in East Africa and the Horn right now. As we've finally been reading in our papers, although it's been clear for months now, it's the worst famine in over 60 years. It has struck especially hard in Somalia, but it also has hit Ethiopia and to a lesser extent Kenya and other Horn and East African countries. What I'd like to focus our attention on is Ethiopia now and 10 years ago, when it was also struck by a drought, and a much less serious drought than the one that we're experiencing now, and had very harsh impact in Ethiopia. And in the 10 years since that drought, Ethiopia, the government, and also the international community have invested in projects in order to deal with what everyone knew would be another drought. I know this firsthand because the IRC has been working in Ethiopia during that whole period. And so we've developed water systems. We've developed ways of storing animal food so that when the famine comes, there's a way of keeping the animals from all dying in the beginning. We've had community health workers who've worked in basic sanitation programs so that people don't all die of cholera and diarrhea as soon as a famine hits. And the result is that famine has been far less serious in Ethiopia this time than 10 years ago, based on very modest relief and development investments. So it is possible to do a lot in areas that are, in ways that are much less expensive than what you have to do if you let crises come full-blown, or even worse, if you wait until war breaks out. Second kind of argument for international relief and development is an economic argument. In the long run, these apparently very poor countries can become productive economic partners for the developed world. And I'll just give you one example. At first it seems so far-fetched, but it in fact is a perfect case study. South Korea was one of the major recipients of American foreign assistance in the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s. South Korea is now one of our most fruitful trading partners and contributes in all kinds of ways to the world economy. So one way to think about international relief and development is we want more South Koreas rather than North Koreas. That cuts it both on the economic front and on the security front. But look, the basic issue is we simply have to be willing to do more of our fair share and standing up for the core values that the U.S. has had. And we have, in fact, been leaders in international relief and development, certainly since World War II and perhaps before that. And we need to recover the standing that brings to us and the self-respect that we can have based on it. Well, okay, those are the three lessons. First, from the very beginning, build capacity in local communities. Second, sound government is crucial. And third, catastrophe prevention is better than emergency intervention. The International Rescue Committee works every day to implement these three lessons around the world. We have a dedicated staff of over 12,000 people. 98% of those outside the U.S. are locals rather than international staff. And in our staff in this country, we have 5 times as many volunteers as we have paid staff. We're also, I think, widely known and highly regarded for the disciplined way in which we allocate our resources. Less than 10%, actually this year 8% of all of our resources go for all administrative overhead, and including fundraising, or to put it the other way around, 92% goes for program costs. And as a further exemplification of this disciplined stewardship, for every private dollar that we receive in contributions, we leverage that 7-fold with further funds from some combination of the U.S. government, the United Nations, the European Community, the Department for International Development in the UK, the Swedish Development Agency, the Canadians, the Australians, the Dutch. We are perfectly happy to receive money from all of those sources as long as it is for priorities that we have already set based on the private donations that we receive and that let us remain an independent actor. Well, I thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to respond to any questions or comments. Oh, yeah, there are microphones, as you will see, right there, and please go up. Say your name and how you connect to this community, and then I'll try to respond.
I'm Kara Sokol, and I just connect here because I've lived here for 20 years. But I was just wondering, you talked quite a bit about strengthening local communities. I know that the practice of microloans, especially microloans to women, have become increasingly popular. I was just wondering what you thought, what your opinion was as to the effectiveness of this, and if that's something your committee uses.
It is something that we do, and I think it's enormously effective. Very modest amounts of money have tremendous multiplication effects. We have found that it works best when, in addition to the actual small amount of money that's either given or is available as a loan, includes a planned saving strategy and meeting in a group of usually women, almost always women actually, who are also undertaking the same process, so that there's a kind of reinforcement and sharing, and also then a sharing of information about what investments, how the investments are paying out, what projects are working well, which ones aren't. As a not trivial side benefit, this kind of capacity of women to develop their own enterprises and generate their own resources is extremely important in societies where gender-based violence is a major challenge, because it gives, first of all, women meeting together can provide security for each other, but secondly, it just gives a kind of standing within the family and within the community that becomes very crucial. So we're big fans of it. Yes?
Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Nicole Garcia, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the IRC goes about entering into a new location or new community.
Sure, I'd be glad to. We almost always start in a community in a crisis. So it can be an emergency, sometimes natural disaster, usually for us a conflict situation, and in which we recognize that there are conflict-uprooted people who just need to have first emergency attention, so basic water, sanitation, healthcare, child-friendly spaces so kids can not be completely targets of whatever conflict is still going on. But as I indicated, once we get into a situation, we work very hard to figure out how we can pursue a strategy that will let folks get on their feet and care for themselves. Now, sometimes that takes a very long time. I don't want to be naive about that. So for example, in Afghanistan, until many Afghans started going back was 12, 15 years, but they have almost all gone back. And similarly, in the Balkans, we were there for 10 years, but we're no longer there because people really developed the capacity to care for themselves. So we tend to get into a crisis and then figure out a way to stay long enough so there'll be something solid to leave when we leave.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming today. My name is Patrick Easton. I'm a first-year student here at the Bush School. My question for you is, you cited the Marshall Plan and South Korea as an sort of a preventative investment, and then now we have fruitful trading with them. What would you say to policymakers who say like Henry Kissinger or someone that comes out of the Cold War, that in places like the Congo and Somalia, there really isn't a national interest to go in there? So I mean, besides the American value, I'm with you on this one, but how do you, in your position, respond to someone with that argument?
Well, let's leave Henry aside, because he's actually an IRC overseer and is supportive of what we do. Although it makes everyone wonder sometimes that that's the case. Look, there's no question that we have countries in which we have a clear and somewhat and direct strategic interest where we need to take steps that are defending our own interests and even our security. But I would argue that countries, even Somalia, Somalia is in many ways a limiting case, but if we don't take seriously the need for those societies to come to a point where they really offer opportunities for their own citizens, we are exposing ourselves to a very major source of antagonists to the United States. It's hard not to do the thought experiment. If we had not left, the United States, the IRC didn't, but if we had not left Afghanistan virtually completely when the Soviets were defeated, I mean, we as you well know, we armed the Mujahideen, we did everything we could to make sure that in fact the Russians were defeated. And the Russians finally said, as the British had before them, okay, enough already, I think we're going to leave. And then we said, well, okay, that's good. We took care of that problem. But we didn't take care of that problem. Instead, we allowed to fester the problem that we then had to deal with after 2001. If we had stayed engaged with Afghanistan after the Soviets left, it would have been very hard to do, but not impossible. We might have had a very different history of the last 15 years in Afghanistan. Now, the IRC we were present in Afghanistan all through that period, but we had to scramble to get resources to do anything that we were doing because there just was no interest in the international community. That's a big problem. So it's not, I mean, I do, as I said in the end of my comments, I do think there's a moral issue involved here. We are a very rich country in spite of all of the problems that we've created for ourselves at the moment in our economy. And we ought to at least do our fair share, which has been defined by the developed world as 0.7%. We're at less than a third of that now. So we're way off the mark. So I think it's a moral imperative. But for people who don't like moral imperatives, and I would agree with you, Henry is among those who don't, then the economic and the security arguments seem to me to be persuasive as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rupp, for coming here and for your service to the international community. My question is, a priority for the IRC is to facilitate stability and democratization. The Arab Spring has created a unique opportunity for international development. How would, or has, the IRC promoted democratization in these post-conflict areas?
Very, very good question. And it's one that I mentioned we usually get ourselves involved in a situation when there's a crisis. In some circumstances, and I used Aceh as an example in my comments before, we're already present, and that makes it much easier. In the case of the Arab Spring, we were not involved in Libya or Egypt or Tunisia. We have sent assessment teams. First, we sent right away to Tunisia to make sure that there weren't issues of refugees or displaced people fleeing, and that seemed to be on a good enough track that they frankly didn't need us. We now are trying to sort out the best way to be involved in both Egypt and Libya. And we have not yet settled that. So, I mean, we're still sorting out the best way to do it. We tend to go into countries that are much further down the scale in terms of socioeconomic capacity, certainly than Egypt is. Egypt is a middle-class country. We're just about to launch an education program in Egypt, and that will be our first step there. But I think it's premature to see what we'll wind up doing. But on the question, your overall question, namely that the Arab Spring offers an opportunity for real building pluralistic and liberal, in the best sense, states, I think that's certainly true, and we are still sorting out the best way that we can contribute to that.
Dr. Rupp, thank you very much for coming by today. My name is Mike Wise, a student here at the Bush School. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts or recommendations on how to enhance cooperation among other NGOs and intergovernmental actors in the participation in the development process.
Well, I think it's a very good question, and I would have to say that I consider the organizations that are the blue chip organizations. I mean, the ones that that IRC considers its peers. I would include CARE, Mercy Corps, Catholic Relief Services, World Vision, and a few others, but not very many others. And I would say our level of cooperation, integration, sharing, in some cases, one being a subcontractor to another, I think there the cooperation is really very good. It's more complicated when there is a crisis that hits the front page and the electronic media. I'll take the tsunami as an example, where all of a sudden, all kinds of people who frankly don't know what they're doing show up and want to provide help and assistance and so on. And I think then it's virtually impossible it's herding cats to try to coordinate the activities. I mentioned in the case of our presence in in Aceh in Indonesia when the tsunami hit. We basically left the place where all these NGOs were flooding in and went to remote fishing villages. And even there, we found some projects that had been started by agencies that came in and then left and never finished them, and they were basically useless until we could salvage them. So I'd have to say there's a lot of amateurism in this space, and it's a matter of really discerning where there's professional work going on and where there isn't. But if you take the outstanding institutions, as I say, both faith-based and not faith-based. I mean, I think we work quite closely together. I'm sorry, that doesn't really, obviously you had something else in mind, and so I'm not being.
I don't have anything else in mind, sir. I guess the challenges in working with the actual government institutions or intergovernment, like the UN or USAID, trying to provide direction.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, bureaucracies of all sorts are very complicated. We're the single largest implementing partner for the UN High Commission of Refugees, and so we have a way of being able to cut through some of that just because we have long experience and we know the key senior people. In the case of the U.S. government or other government agencies, the reason private funding is so important for us, and let me put it again quantitatively, our budget is about $400 million. And the absolutely key slice of that is the $55–60 million that are private, because that lets us decide where are the highest priorities, what do we need to do, we go and do it, and then we will submit a proposal to USAID or to the Department for International Development, and we already know what we think needs to be done. And we don't just submit a blind proposal. We look for, as you do if you were looking for a job on a website, you'd look for ones that sort of reasonably well fit. And then we send in a proposal, and if they fund it, then we are able to multiply what we would otherwise be doing, and that's usually the way it works. I don't mean it's always smooth. It takes a huge amount of effort. We have a lot of our people on the ground and at headquarters spend time massaging these proposals. But the result is we can do 7 times as much as we could do if we only did what in some ways would be easier, just go with the private funding and do whatever we can do with that. So it's worth a lot of effort to multiply by 7, and that's why we do the extra work. Yes?
Thank you for taking your time out of your day to come speak with us. I got a question in regards to land grant institutions. What role do you see them playing in development efforts in relation to private development consultancies or firms? Well,
the land grant institutions have a long and proud history of working on development, including agricultural development in this country, but then also internationally. Pete McPherson, who was I first knew as the president of Michigan State, was also the head of USAID in the Reagan administration. Really, I think, saw the ways in which the land grant tradition could and should work with international relief and development. And I think it has not happened as much as it could, but I think it would be a wonderful way for land grant institutions to do what Michigan State, I think, really did do, namely to capture to take their roots and connect them, plant them also in the international arena. It hasn't happened as much as it could and should, but we hope it will happen more, and it will happen more if the incredible funding crunch that's about to descend on USAID is survived. Okay, well, thank you all very much. I appreciate your time.